if you read into detail, you see this is not the only thing he's misjudged. Indeed, we'll be speaking with journalist and businessman Andrew Neil, who has a very powerful piece in one of the newspapers this morning, the Daily Mail, which I have to say chronicles some of the decisions made by this no-mark politician. But let's hear exactly what took place yesterday. Towards the end of our show, our Scotland political editor Gina Davidson said we could expect that statement from the First Minister at around midday, and she was on the money. Sure enough, just after noon, Humza Yousaf took his place behind a lectern in Edinburgh and made an at times emotional 11-minute speech during which he confirmed he would be stepping down.
Unfortunately, in ending the Butte House Agreement in the manner that I did, I clearly underestimated the level of hurt and upset that caused Green colleagues. I've concluded that repairing our relationship across the political divide can only be done with someone else at the helm. As a young boy, born and raised in Scotland, I could never have dreamt that one day I would have the privilege of leading my country. Politics can be a brutal business. It takes its toll on your physical and mental health. Your family suffer alongside you. I am in absolute debt to my wonderful wife, my beautiful children, and my wider family for putting up with me over the years. I'm afraid you will be seeing a lot more of me from now.
The First Minister went on to say the idea of leading Scotland should be a privilege afforded to everyone. Well, the way the SNP are going, he might achieve that dream. So whose turn is it now? Well, right in the frame is John Swinney, Nicola Sturgeon's long-time right-hand man, the party leader between 2000 and 2004. He received a ringing endorsement from the SNP's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, who spoke to the Newsagents, the global podcast.
These are deeply serious times. They're serious times for the public who are struggling with the consequences of the cost of living crisis, who are looking for hope and for aspiration for their future from the government. I think there's only one person who has the experience to do that job. I think there's only one person who can unite the party. I think there's only one person who can unite the country and have that vision that he can then go on and deliver. And I would like to think that person would be John Swinney.
Meanwhile, reaction in Westminster, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on ITV.
What people in Scotland deserve is a government that is focused on what they care about and not constitutional wrangling and obsessing about independence. From the moment I got this job, I've said that I'm happy to work constructively with the government in Scotland to deliver for people on the things they care about. And what the SNP government should be focused on is day-to-day issues like the economy, like the NHS, not obsessing about independence or indeed gender recognition.
And lastly, too, I imagine, a rather jubilant Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer.
The Scottish people are being fundamentally let down. 1 in 7 are on waiting lists. There's a cost of living crisis, and all the SNP can offer is chaos. And we've got to turn the page on this now. We need that general election and a fresh start.
Right, let's bring into the conversation Andrew Neil, who's a broadcaster, businessman, chairman of The Spectator, former editor of the Sunday Times. As I said, has a very powerful piece in today's Daily Mail in which he charts how Humza Yousaf, as Transport Minister, wasn't able to build ferries or widen a road. As Justice Minister, he was equally failing, and as Health Minister, Andrew says he left Scotland's NHS in an even worse shape. And then to another newspaper, Andrew, The Times decides that he is the embodiment of the hubris and incompetence that brought the juggernaut of the SNP to a standstill. Would you concur with that? Morning, Andrew.
Good morning to you. Yes, I would. The very purpose of the SNP is to create Scottish independence, to separate Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. That's going nowhere. That's not going to happen. That's off for a generation, if not for more now. So what's the fallback? They've been in power for 17 years. They run on their record. Well, their record is terrible, from schools to hospitals to roads. The domestic record is terrible. They've destroyed what was once the finest education system in the world. The most dangerous road in Scotland, the A9 through the Highlands. They've not been able to turn it into a dual carriageway, and they've done nothing to fit Scotland for the 21st century, where times are going to be tough for it. So they can't really run on their record either, which is why they're finished.
16 years they've been in power, and they've taken 17. A nation of... Is it 17? Sorry, Andrew, of which I know you're fiercely proud, and you look at the inventions, everything from the fridge to the pneumatic tyre to, as you rightly say, education that was the envy of the world. How have they done it? How have they turned it into a basket case?
They've done it for two reasons, or because of two reasons. One, because of their obsession with constitutional change rather than the good government of Scotland. Their purpose was always independence. It was always a grievance machine. That whatever went wrong, it was always Scotland, always Westminster's fault. And by the way, Westminster is a euphemism for the English, being no doubt about. There's an anti-English strain in all of this. It was never their fault. They never did anything wrong. It was always Westminster's fault, even though Westminster pours buckets of gold down their throat every year, and public spending in Scotland is far, far higher per person than it is in England. And the other reason is that they're dominated by the collectivist consensus in Scotland, a left-wing consensus, far more left than than England, in which there was no reform of the health service whatsoever, no reform of education whatsoever, spending more on welfare payments rather than building up the infrastructure of Scotland to fit it for the 21st century. You add all that together, and you have, I'm afraid, north of the border, a country in serious decline.
Your piece in the Mail, lastly, Andrew, concludes with the suggestion or a dream of a Scottish Renaissance. How is that to be brought about?
Well, I don't know, because it's badly needed, and we need to start again, and Scotland needs to get its act together, and it needs to equip itself for the 21st century. But the Scottish Financial Centre is a shadow of what it was. North Sea oil is running out, and a lot of the politicians there don't want anything to do with oil and gas anyway. They're in the hands of the green blob. And technology, digital technology in Scotland, barring a few centres, is no great shake. So what let me put it this way, where the plight of Scotland is. In the year 1900, at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, 20% of the world's ships were built on the Clyde. 20%.
Yeah.
Now they can't even build two ferries for the islands. I rest my case.
And that, of course, also tracks back to Mr. Yousaf in a previous incarnation as the Transport Minister. Andrew Neil, thank you, broadcaster, chairman of The Spectator, and in today's Daily Mail, former editor of the Sunday Times as well. Listening at 13 minutes after 7 even, Lesley Riddoch, who's a broadcaster, independence campaigner, columnist, and has the podcast, the Lesley Riddoch Podcast, which is on Global Player, joins me now. OK, Andrew saying that the dreams are buried for a generation at least. Would you concur with that? Morning.
Morning. Honestly, if we just played that last 5 minutes to the whole of Scotland, we'd have 80% independence.
Why is that, Lesley?
A load of absolute rubbish. I mean, first of all, let's just work through the claims there. I mean, amazingly, although I live in the sticks in North Fife, I'm connecting to you via digital media. How on earth am I doing that? In Scotland, we voted to have... Let me just continue, since you let him. We have water in public ownership in Scotland, unlike the disaster south of the border, where 19 water companies, most owned by foreign companies, have reduced your rivers to a slew of sewage. We have the best performing A&E departments in the whole of the UK. We have less privatisation in health, and glory be for that. We have had no strikes in the health sector, no strikes last year in the sphere of transport and rail. So, of course things are not going beautifully, but there's plenty of progress that the people of Scotland, and here's a small point, if Andrew cared to come and live here, he might realise people actually like this so-called collectivist agenda, because solidarity between people and having a public realm is what makes life worth living for most people.
OK, but how can you possibly defend what's happened to your education system?
Well, what do you mean defend what's happened to it?
Well, they've come down, it was, as Andrew rightly said, I don't know about world leading, it certainly was number one in Europe, and it's now come down what are called the PISA tables. I've got it in front of me, Lesley.
It has. But PISA is one measurement of things, but I'm not arguing with you. It has come down. I think a lot of people would want to say that education is very strongly a function of poverty, that the difficulty, and I'll quite grant you, I always disagreed with Nicola, hugging to her, the ability to shrink the education gap, when so much of it is determined by benefits and a generally thriving society, when you've got generations of unemployed people who are lingering on benefits that even with mitigation in Scotland are still hardly making people able to live, you will not get very good educational outcomes.
The Times reports that life expectancy in parts of Glasgow for men is lower than it is in parts of Africa.
Yeah, well, whoop,
Well,
whoop.
this is the reality of Scotland, isn't it,
Yes,
Lesley?
but Nick,
I mean, I hear what you say about water, and my God, you're right, our water is absolutely shocking. But I don't know that you can paint Scotland as nirvana after 17 years of SNP,
I
can
have
you?
not claimed that it's a nirvana. I've said that the decisions that have been made are the ones that we would like to make more of, because at the moment what we're stuck with is, for example, the Scottish Parliament has fewer borrowing powers than the average council. So if we wanted to tackle heat, for example, which is a big problem here because we have the worst fuel poverty in Europe, with all these energy resources, energy controlled by Westminster, we want that back so we can put district heating into every home. But the Scottish Parliament can't borrow the money to do that.
Well, how do you imagine the SNP will fare at the next elections then? You don't think there'll be a judgment from the voters?
Well, but the thing is, Nick, how do you imagine?
Well, respectfully, you're the Scottish commentator, but I mean, I'll give you my verdict, but you're closer to it than I.
Well, I think you're quite a commentator yourself, actually.
Yeah, but you live there. You know better than me. I am hearing and I am reading that it's going to be pretty ugly for the SNP. Do you agree with that?
Well, it might be or it might not be. I mean,
well, if they're so good, why might it be ugly?
Right, you're asking me a question. I'll give you an answer then.
Go on, then.
50% of people support independence in Scotland. And my question to you had been, where do you think they're going to go?
I doubt vote for a party that's, I would have thought now, has collapsed in a degree of ignominy.
Well, wow, if we were at that stage, and I will absolutely grant you that the more times you change leader, the weaker you become. And the greater example of that is clearly the party that currently runs the whole UK on the basis of an election a long time ago that was 40% of the vote, giving them an 8-seat majority.
There you go, doing exactly what Andrew Neil says some folk do, which is point to Westminster at times of trouble. Why is that pertinent to my question to you about the SNP?
Because we live in a country with two governments. In Scotland, we live in a country with a Scottish government that takes care of devolved stuff on a budget that is set, that it has to balance at the end of each year. You can't borrow, and it can be spent a little bit extra in certain directions. We want to use this to go in a very different direction with stuff, and that's where the Westminster end comes in.
We're running late. Last question. Do you think the SNP will get to 2026?
Of course they will. I mean, I would absolutely put hard money that this party will not suddenly collapse because, and the final point to make, it's a proportional parliament. You have to do deals here. It wasn't set up to have any. There's been one majority parliament in 25 years. So deals have to be done. This one was pulled out of badly, and there will be a successor.
I've really enjoyed our conversation. Check out the Lesley Riddoch podcast, available on Global